Chapter 23, The Great Depression. In late 1928, Herbert Hoover told the American people in a speech, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land." 15 months later, 1 year and 3 months, those words would haunt him as the nation plunged into a 10-year, decade-long, debilitating economic depression that shocked the world. The financial collapse of 1929 followed an extended rally on Wall Street, famously, where a decade of strong returns had attracted ordinary Americans to invest millions of their own dollars in the burgeoning economy. As speculative fever grew more intense, as all bubbles get blown up, the market began to finally fall apart. On October 29, 1929, the stock market lost 10% of its value in one day. Within a month, stocks had lost half their value. The Great Depression that followed can be blamed in part on the collapse of Wall Street. But economists and historians point to other events that deepened and severely lengthened the crisis. A lack of diversification in the economy, the maldistribution of purchasing power across American society, misguided protectionist policies like the Smoot-Hawley tariff, problems and speculation in the banking industry, the expansion of the European economies after World War I, the failure of the Central Powers to pay their wartime reparations, and even all of the meddling that's going to happen by government in this era. All of it contributed to the collapse of the global market. The stock market crash of 1929, called Black Tuesday pretty commonly, did not so much cause the economic depression as it did trigger a chain of events that exposed larger weaknesses within the United States economy. The collapse of the banking system took with it 9,000 banks in the first 3 years of the crisis, shrinking the nation's money supply and access to credit. 25 people were out of work by 1932. In some cities in the Northeast and Midwest, over one-half the adult population was out of work, and early welfare systems struggled to serve the long lines of Americans asking for help. Things were even worse in rural America. 1/3 of all American farmers lost their land during the Depression, and the Great Plains suffered from a catastrophic natural disaster beginning in 1930, commonly called the Dust Bowl, which stretched north from Texas all the way to the Dakotas. Drought and heat continued for a decade, turning what had been fertile farm regions into a virtual desert. Hundreds of thousands of families abandoned their land and wandered from city to city looking for work. Because many of these folks were from Oklahoma, they earned the nickname Okies as they shuffled across the West looking for a new source of income. As the price of cotton collapsed during the Depression and Dust Bowl, the sharecropping industry fell apart. The movement of African Americans from the rural South into America's northern cities accelerated. Their prospects for work in northern cities weren't much better than southern cities. Traditional patterns of segregation and disenfranchisement in the South survived the Depression largely unchallenged, though America did turn its attention to the issue of race in the trial of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused of the rape of 2 white women and eventually acquitted of the crime. Similar patterns of discrimination confronted many Mexicans and Asian Americans in the West who found it difficult to find dependable work during the Depression. Minorities often lost jobs to white Americans, sometimes Okies who had lost their land at the Dust Bowl, desperate for work. Women, too, were pushed out of the workplace in favor of men. Still, even at the end of the 1930s, 38% of black women and 24% of white women had jobs outside the home. Though the Depression made divorce less common, unemployed men sometimes deserted their families in an effort to escape the humiliation of being unable to earn a living wage. The Great Depression, needless to say, was a traumatic experience for millions of Americans, but it had the unintended impact of shaping American values for decades to come. The ideals of work and individual responsibility survived the decade, and American culture, via radio and the movies, flourished as an escapist diversion from personal hardships. Almost every family had a radio in the 1930s, and listening tended to be a communal community experience. Lots of people would gather around it. Superman, The Lone Ranger, comedians and soap operas filled the airwaves with drama, laughter, and advertisements. Radio news and sports grew rapidly to meet demand. The World Series, the Academy Awards, political convention, even Orson Welles' famous Halloween night, The War of the Worlds broadcast, The War of the Worlds, all reached Americans over radio during the Great Depression. Ticket sales for movies were more popular than ever during the Great Depression. Frank Capra's movies, he deserves a spot up here, Frank Capra. His movies, including Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It's a Wonderful Life, took me a second there, all helped audiences find solace in the vision of an imagined American past, in the warmth and goodness of idealized small towns and the decency of ordinary people in America. Screwball comedies like the Marx Brothers movies, Walt Disney's cartoons like Snow White, and movies based on popular fiction like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz helped divert audiences from the tremendous disillusionment and the increasing radicalism of the time. The Communist Party flourished during the Great Depression. Long and unrelenting critic of American capitalism, communists banded together to create an anti-fascist group called the Popular Front in America, which was in fact not so secretly controlled by the USSR, the Soviet Union. The Popular Front united with many progressive groups and offered an alternative socialist-leaning path for America as it faced these economic hardships. In a show of force, 3,000 young American members of the Popular Front committed themselves to the Spanish Civil War during the Depression, where, as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, they fought against the Hitler and Mussolini-backed Francisco Franco on behalf of a Republican government in Spain. Communists were active in organizing the unemployed in America. They staged a hunger march on Washington, D.C. in 1931 and stood with those Scottsboro boys against racial injustice. They were not, though, the open patriotic organization they pretended to be, and when Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis in 1939, they were ordered to abandon the Popular Front and resume their criticisms of American society. Disillusioned, thousands of Americans left the movement. A few times before or since in American history did being a part of the political left seem so respectable or even conventional among the American people. The 1930s experienced a widening of the ideological range of the mainstream. The New Deal, which we'll talk about a lot, for instance, sponsored artistic work through the Works Progress Administration that challenged capitalist norms, and New Deal-backed filmmakers and photographers and painters offered harsh critiques of the exploitation of people and the environment that industrial capitalism had produced. John Steinbeck was the most successful chronicler of social conditions in the 1930s, specifically in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. There he is, John Steinbeck. Herbert Hoover, when faced with American economic collapse, relied on the principles that had always governed his public life. Early in the crisis, he called on business and union leaders to adopt a program of voluntary cooperation for recovery. But economic conditions deteriorated so quickly that the structure of ideas soon collapsed. He attempted to use government spending to fight the Depression, but the paltry sum in today's standards failed to stimulate the economy. And with an eye on the national budget, he avoided further stimulus efforts. He helped pass laws to maintain agricultural prices and to disincentivize agricultural imports, but surpluses and declining consumption kept the farm economy in total crisis. 2 years into his presidential term, Hoover's political position had deteriorated considerably. Republicans lost the House and came close to losing the Senate in 1930. But Hoover resisted Democratic calls for more spending. Many Americans blamed Hoover personally for the Depression and took to calling the shanty towns of the poor and the homeless on city outskirts Hoovervilles, tent encampments of the poor. By 1931, Hoover had no choice but to back measures to keep banks afloat and homeowners in their houses, he believed. By $1.5 billion was set aside for the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a government agency organized to provide federal loans to troubled banks, railroads, and businesses. But the agency was overly conservative by many critics and failed to even spend all the money it had allocated. During the first several years of the Depression, many Americans were either too stunned or confused to take political action. By the middle of 1932, though, voices of protest began to emerge. Unhappy farmers in western Iowa organized a farmer strike to withhold goods from the market, and a bonus army of 20,000 plus veterans of World War I marched on Washington, promising to stay until Congress approved special legislation that would pay them their $1,000 retirement bonus, which was not due for 15 years, immediately. Their presence in Washington, right on Pennsylvania Avenue next to the White House, embarrassed Hoover, who ordered police to clear out marchers of the abandoned buildings they'd been staying in the Hoovervilles they'd put up. General Douglas MacArthur carried out the mission and greatly exceeded the president's orders. He literally led tanks with a machine gun detachment down Pennsylvania Avenue in pursuit of the bonus army, who fled in terror. Their tent cities were burned, and Hoover, who personified the optimistic days of the 1920s, became a symbol of the nation's failure to deal effectively with its reversal of fortunes. Hoover was nominated by Republicans in 1932 for the office of the presidency again, but few people believed he could win. The Democrats gathered in Chicago to nominate the governor of New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. A distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, FDR had initiated enough programs of government assistance to be able to present himself as a more energetic and imaginative leader than Hoover. He avoided divisive cultural issues and emphasized economic grievances that people shared. He flew to Chicago in a plane to accept his nomination and promised the American people a New Deal. And that'll be a theme. He won with 57.4% of the popular vote, and Democrats took both houses of Congress. In the interregnum, period between the election and the inauguration of the new president, the American banking system began to collapse. Depositors withdrew their money in panic, and one bank after another declared bankruptcy. They ran out of cash. Hoover publicly sought Roosevelt's assurance that he would continue his hands-off approach to the economy, and Roosevelt publicly refused. On the morning of March 4th, 1933, a defeated Herbert Hoover rode bitterly down Pennsylvania Avenue with a beaming Franklin Delano Roosevelt on his side to the inauguration of the new president. As a man elected 4 times to be the American president and a man who had served more than 12 years in office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt fundamentally altered the federal government and its relationship to American society. He did so by the force of his personality and the ambitiousness of his legislative agenda. His bank holiday brought a general sense of relief and hope during the bank panic he inherited. They shut down the banks for a period of time. And his fireside chats quickly became a staple on American radios. It spoke directly to the American people. People really liked it. His first handful of measures, the Emergency Banking Act, the Economy Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, the Truth and Securities Act, etc., sailed through the new Democratic Congress. Laws designed to get banks back in the black while curbing speculation and ensuring individual deposits by individual Americans up to $2,500, so there would be money there if they needed it, restoring confidence in the banks. Other laws required corporations to make their organization and balance sheets public. They made the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the police of the stock market. With a movement to repeal the 18th Amendment afoot, Roosevelt even signed a bill to legalize the manufacture and sale of beer, low-alcohol beer, which boosted his popularity further. More comprehensive legislation followed these early stopgap measures. Congress authorized the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA, 1933, which imposed production limits on crops and paid subsidies on idled land. Parity, that idea of parity I'd mentioned essentially. In doing so, Congress sought to control crop prices by federal law, but the legislation favored larger landowners and was challenged later within the Supreme Court. Other acts were passed to assist poor farmers as well, by moving entire family operations to places with more optimal soil and making electric power more available to rural farms through utility cooperatives. In business, Roosevelt's administration lifted antitrust laws and the proviso that workers' right to bargain collectively be supported by business leaders. They also established the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which called on every business in the nation to accept a minimum wage of between 30 to 40 cents an hour and a maximum work week of 35 to 40 hours per week, and the abolition of child labor. The idea with the maximum hours per week is if I would generally hire people at 50 hours per week and I have 5 of them, well, I can cut that to 40 and hire someone new. With a blue eagle as their mascot, the National Recovery Administration enjoyed, at least briefly, the popular support of the nation's businesses and the American people. But the NRA fumbled its mission and actually proved a drain on the nation's purchasing power. In 1935, the Supreme Court intervened in a case involving NRA code violations in a poultry business in Brooklyn, New York. Using the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, the court found that Congress had given unconstitutional authority to the executive branch, the president, and the National Recovery Administration was no more. While the New Dealers who supported the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Recovery Administration favored economic planning by the central government with the help of private interests, other reformers believed that the government itself should be the chief planner of the American economy. The best example of their work can still be found in the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a holdover of the public power movement, which rose against sometimes corrupt corporate control over energy production and prices. The Tennessee Valley Authority under Roosevelt was authorized to dam and harness some of the nation's most powerful water currents in order to ensure a reasonable price for electricity in rural places. The Tennessee Valley Authority was understood to be a success, and private electricity rates were lower thanks to the federal government's intervention in this market. But the Tennessee Valley Authority serves the Southeast. The largest New Deal public works programs, the great dams and power stations, were mainly out in the American West. more government funds would eventually be spent out west per capita than anywhere else in the country. Roosevelt did not consider unemployment relief his number one goal, but he did pass the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which is the first federal government handout for the unemployed. What was more successful was the Civilian Works Administration, CWA, which put more than 4 million people to work on temporary projects between November of 1933 and April of 1934. They built roads, schools, parks. Soon afterwards, Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, more famously the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, created camps in national parks and forests and put inner city men who were out of work to work, planting trees, building reservoirs, and improving agricultural irrigation. The Roosevelt administration also worked to provide mortgage relief for millions of farm and homeowners between 1933 and 1936. 4 major laws were passed, and the Federal Housing Administration was established to ensure mortgages for new construction and home repairs. Despite this, 1/4 of all farmers lost their land still during the Great Depression. By 1935, the American people were tiring of Roosevelt's New Deal. In response, Roosevelt doubled down on a second New Deal, Part 2. Plenty of people did not like Franklin D. Roosevelt, especially people from the very aristocratic world he had come from. He was often called a traitor to his class and was despised generally by the wealthy, who were the target of his big taxes. He was despised by big business, who had to deal with his new regulations. Rumors swirled among conservatives that Roosevelt was a drug addict and that he was surrounded by psychiatrists, that he was a closet communist. Whatever their opinions, the New Deal did lack a clear ideology and represented a series of liberal experiments, many of which failed. Out of that confusion, conservative business leaders and their Liberty League, led an attack on the New Deal as we approached his second term here, pointing to dictatorial policies and its challenges to free enterprise. It was the only organized resistance to Roosevelt's New Deal, and though it quickly resolved after Roosevelt was elected to his second term. More powerful than the Liberty League were 3 genuinely populist criticisms or critiques of Roosevelt's New Deals. Dr. Francis Townsend's 5 million strong lobby for senior citizens' pensions, that's coming. Father Charles Coughlin's radio broadcast sermons for monetary policy reform. And Senator Huey P. Long and his Share Our Wealth plan. There it is, the Share Our Wealth plan, which advocated the government end the Depression tomorrow by confiscating money from the wealthy and redistributing it to the poor. Louisiana Senator Huey P. Long. It was in response to these populist outcries that Roosevelt launched that second New Deal in the spring of 1935, just a year before re-election. This time around, Roosevelt had no qualms attacking big business openly. To undercut the popularity of Huey Long's Share Our Wealth plan, the president established the highest and most progressive peacetime tax rates in American history. He also signed the Wagner Act, which provided workers with the National Labor Relations Board, which had the power to compel employers to recognize and bargain with legitimate unions. In the 1930s, unskilled workers created and joined massive new industrial unions. Where old craft unions had grouped people working in the same professions, industrial unions sought to incorporate and embolden workers across an entire industry. Through the AFL, craft unions, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations split in 1935, the CIO and its industrial unions quickly gained traction among workers in the auto and the steel industries, and they courted previously unorganized minorities and women in industries like laundries and tobacco factories. In 1936, the United Auto Workers, one of these union groups, employed a controversial and effective new technique for challenging corporate opposition to their unions, the very peaceful sit-down strike. Employees in General Motors factories simply sat down on the floor and refused to move at the job site. The tactics spread, and 2 months later, strikers were occupying 17 General Motors plants. Both the state of Michigan and the federal government refused to intervene, and General Motors was forced to recognize the UAW, the Auto Workers Union. That same year, the U.S. Steel recognized the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, though smaller steel companies remained opposed. The Memorial Day Massacre, though, was one of the last gaps of the kind of brutal strike breaking that had been so effective in the past. In 1937 alone, there were 4,720 labor strikes, and over 80% were settled in favor of the unions. By 1941, 10 million people were members of American unions. From the earliest days of the New Deal, members of FDR's inner circle called for a system of federally sponsored social insurance for the elderly and the unemployed. In 1935, as a part of his second New Deal, Roosevelt gave his support to the idea of the Social Security Act, which passed through Congress in the same year. It incorporated many segments of the population into a federal pension system to which they and their employers will contribute through a payroll tax to be paid back upon retirement. It also included and established a system of federal aid to people with disabilities and a program in aid of dependent children. Though its framers wanted to create a system of insurance, not welfare, the scope of Social Security has expanded considerably since its Depression-era origins, and everyone is familiar with it. While Social Security focused on long-range problems, the Roosevelt administration established the Works Progress Administration, there it is, to deal with the continuing unemployment problem across the country. Much bigger than the employment agencies of the first New Deal, the Works Progress Administration, which served mostly unemployed men, built and renovated 110,000 bridges, constructed more than 600 airports, laid more than 500,000 miles of road, and connected over 100,000 bridges. Even paid artists, musicians, actors, and directors to continue to pursue their artistic visions in the absence of actual market demand. In 1936, in part due to Huey Long's assassination, Roosevelt won in a landslide re-election bid. The election results demonstrated the party realignment that the New Deal had produced. The Democrats, and I previously just mentioned as a very diverse and unorganized group, now controlled a broad coalition of Western and Southern farmers, the urban working classes, the poor and unemployed, Black communities in the North, as well as traditional progressives and new liberals. It would be decades before the Republican Party could reclaim a lasting majority of its own, where they had been dominant in the 1920s. It would be many, many decades before Republicans would come back in earnest. Well aware of the uncertain legal foundations of many of his New Deal programs, Roosevelt tried to use his 1936 mandate and re-election to weaken the Supreme Court. No program of reform, he believed, could survive the conservative justices who had already struck down two of his original New Deal programs. In February of 1937, the president proposed an overhaul of the federal court system. Buried in those changes was one provision to add 6 justices to the United States Supreme Court. He claimed the 9 justices were overworked, but in reality, he wanted to give himself the opportunity to appoint new liberal justices to ensure that any future challenges to his New Deal programs would find a more favorable audience. Conservatives and some liberals were outraged by Roosevelt's court-packing plan. But the Supreme Court received the message loud and clear. Where they had reliably invalidated New Deal programs went up for discussion or under lawsuit. 5-4 during his first term, the court quickly took a more moderate position on cases involving New Deal programs, upholding challenges to the Social Security and the Wagner Acts the month after Roosevelt introduced his court-packing plan. By the summer of 1937, the American economy was nearly back on its feet. National income was approaching 1929 levels, and the president seized on economic improvements and turned to balancing the federal budget that he'd blown out. In the first half of 1937, he cut the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in half, effectively laying off 1.5 million people who were working for the government. Within weeks, the fragile boom had collapsed. Another 4 million people lost their jobs. Critics called this event the Roosevelt Recession, and the president responded by abandoning his focus on the federal deficit and asking Congress for an emergency appropriation of another $5 billion for public works and relief programs. He also denounced what he called an unjustifiable concentration of economic power and challenged Congress to consider new major reforms to aging antitrust laws. The 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act was the last real gasp of Roosevelt's ambitious New Deal programs. Where Roosevelt's earlier programs had asked businesses to voluntarily support federal labor policies, this law established a mandatory minimum wage, a 40-hour work week. It placed strict limits on child labor. By 1938, the New Deal had come to an end, for all intents and purposes. Congressional opposition now made it difficult for the president to enact any major new reforms, and stirrings of war in Europe would soon shift Roosevelt's attention east. Roosevelt and his New Deal policies were largely embraced by the African American community. Hundreds of thousands of African Americans found work in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration, where most blacks had voted Republican in 1932. Remember who freed the slaves. More than 90% were voting Democratic by 1936. Roosevelt did, however, avoid federal legislation to stunt poll taxes and the threat of lynchings in the South for fear of losing his Southern Democratic votes. New Deal policy towards the Indian tribes marked a significant break from history under Roosevelt's Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier. Collier, a cultural relativist of sorts, believed that Native American societies should be respected on their own terms, and he promoted legislation and practices to restore the tribes the right to own land collectively, like they had previously, and to elect tribal governments. Under his Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, America's tribes were able to purchase tens of millions of new acres of land, but much of it was arid and unfit for productive purposes. Similarly, while New Deal programs certainly did not advocate for gender equality, it did obtain special protections for women in some cases. Today, the most frequent criticisms of Roosevelt's New Deal involve its failure to actually revive the American economy. Some critics would actually argue that all of this government spending actually prolonged the Depression. Nonetheless, the New Deal did significantly alter the experience of ordinary Americans across the 20th century in an undeniable way. It helped elevate factory workers and farmers to positions from which they could at times challenge the power they struggled with in terms of corporations. It gave the federal government incredible regulatory functions and brought some stability to previously troubled areas of American life. It created the rudiments of the American welfare state as we know it, and it turned the Democratic Party into a mighty coalition. With its public works spending, the monuments to the New Deal can still be seen in the old brick buildings out east, in the placid man-made reservoirs of the American West, and in the curve of county roads all across this country. While the economic boom sparked by World War II and the reconversion after the war, not the New Deal, finally ended the Great Depression, Roosevelt's programs turned Americans away from the controversial cultural issues and awakened an interest in the economic well-being of the nation.